just bear that in mind, everyone. So, all right, so we're going to talk about vocal weight. So, when I say the kind of like term vocal weight, do people know what this means, or do people are people feeling kind of lost when they hear that term? What's up with that? Not really. Okay, so we can basically think of vocal weight as like the intensity of the sound. So, for example, this would be a very low vocal weight, whereas like would be like a higher vocal weight. So we're kind of like seeing if we can kind of move on a gradient between very soft to like more intense or like more heavy, right? My voice isn't really doing heavy too well today, but that's fine. So what we might kind of like think about is what are some like tools we can use? What are some ways we could explore finding higher vocal weight sounds? So what I'm going to use this kind of like recording for is mostly just kind of going over some kind of like more kind of like exercises and things that people can use, so people have that to refer back to, I guess. And then if anybody in chat has any questions or things they want to talk about, then that's also fine. So one of the first things that we could try is kind of like you might know it as quotient drills, but what I'm talking about is, and you know, you can kind of use quotient somewhat interchangeably with vocal weight, or at least it gets used that way. I don't know if it really should be used that way, but it does get used that way. But we can kind of like, you know, focus on one of the first options we have. So how might we play around with increasing vocal weight? So one of these things is trying to see what happens if we slide down in pitch and get louder as we go. So that might sound something like right, and we might try to get something kind of like, you know, heavier as we go down. So what else might we try to kind of like think about? So that's one of the first things we can try, but it's definitely not like the end of our list of options, right? So, you know, when doing this kind of stuff, oftentimes we're thinking about how we can apply it in the context of like voice masculinization, right? So what we might also be interested in is kind of like trying to kind of like find weightier sounds that are lower in pitch, right? Because oftentimes it's easier to get to weighty sounds that are higher up in pitch. So what could we try in that scenario? We could have a go at kind of like sliding down and trying to go soft as we go and then increase when we get to the bottom. So that might be something like so maybe we get somewhere like that, and then we might try to get louder, and we might notice a change in pitch as we do this, right? And we might be able to kind of like have a go at kind of like increasing vocal weight that way, right? So one thing we can try doing is kind of increasing weight as we kind of go down in pitch, or as we're at kind of like lower points, and then try to increase weight there and see if we can kind of like work on those two together, right? So but what are some more kind of like pure ways that we can, so what we might want to think about when we're thinking about vocal weight is, you know, there's kind of two aspects maybe we want to think about, right? So I sound like the bear. No recording. No, I'm not heavy enough for the bear. Okay. So what we could have a go at kind of doing is, I feel like I need to give it another go. No recording. No, I don't have weight today. No recording. No, there's none there. It's weak. Okay, so what we can kind of like, what we might want to kind of like try doing is playing around with weight gradients by themselves for kind of like the sake of consistency and awareness of like the feeling we're going for, right? So what we could try doing is kind of like choosing a pitch. It doesn't have to be like at the lowest point in our range. It can be a little bit up from that, and we can just try kind of like moving on a gradient from louder to quieter, aiming to get a little bit louder each time as we go. So right? And you know, this is pretty correlated with volume when we do this, right? So we do want to bear in mind that it could get relatively loud when we do this, but bearing in mind as well that there's a relationship between weight and pitch, whereby the lower in pitch you go, the like less the lower in pitch you go, the kind of like less loud a loud sound will kind of sound, right? So for example, will probably sound relatively loud to most people, regardless of like the technical power behind it, regardless of the vocal weight behind that sound. Whereas like, right, you know, includes quite a lot of like air quotes vocal fold mass, but it's not really the loudest sound in the world, right? So we've got this balancing act between, you know, pitch and vocal weight to kind of think about when we're doing all this kind of stuff. So what we can do is play around with these gradients at different points throughout our range and just see if we can get louder, more intense on any particular sounds. So you can do this as kind of like one continuous sound or as kind of discrete little dots. Somebody just said people can't hear me when I'm speaking lower, right? So I'm assuming you kind of mean in pitch, yeah? So this kind of is a little bit of like that projection issue, right? So, you know, if we're kind of like lower down in pitch, but we're kind of like not quite as weighty as we might want to be, it's going to be pretty like hard to hear in comparison, right? So if we were kind of like a little bit higher with like a similar kind of like amount of weight going on, right? So it's a little bit, there is a balancing act here that we want to kind of like work on a little bit, right? So when we're kind of like thinking about this, these kind of gradients and things, we can do it as a continuous sound, for example. But we can also do it as like discrete sounds. So So let's talk about those kind of discrete sounds. So when you do these discrete sounds, you have the opportunity to focus on the start of the sounds. So let's just like make some different sounds, but the start of the sound's a little bit different. So right, versus kind of like right? So you could hear that on the second set of sounds there, the vocal folds were kind of almost like closed at the start, and there was this kind of like burst of energy, right? So one thing we can think about is playing around with the start of the sounds and seeing if that enables us to kind of get to louder qualities than if we were to, let's say, you know, not start with those kind of like harder onsets or those harder starts of the sounds. So, right? Those kind of sounds are relatively loud, right? But again, they're the kind of sounds that, you know, if we're not really mindful of it, dependent on what part of our range that's in, that might not be like the bestest sound ever. So what happens if I tried going for like these heavier onsets and go down in pitch? So like this is a heavier sound, right? Obviously, as I kind of go for that sound, you can hear that it sounds a little bit kind of like unpracticed, right? Or a little bit kind of meh, right? So this is kind of the thing, right? You can't just necessarily rely on one part of the sound. You have to kind of like practice getting to this quality over and over again. Maybe seeing if you can kind of like find this kind of like heavier onset quality, if that helps you get to a heavier sound. Right? And see if you can get back to that quality without needing the onset to get there. Right? And trying to kind of like recreate that and see if you can almost create more fluidity or more kind of, you know, comfort when you kind of go for these sounds. So more kind of like practicedness, if that's a word. I don't think it is. And try and kind of like improve that. So that's another thing we can kind of think about, right? You know, whether we can use the starts of sounds where the vocal folds are closed to help us find heavier sounds to start off with, right? But there's also some other stuff that we can kind of think about. So one of the other kind of prompts that we might want to think about when we're talking about vocal weight is, so I kind of said that we can think of vocal weight as kind of like the buzziness or the kind of like intensity of the sound. So there is a little bit of a relationship here between things like twang and resonance and all of this kind of stuff. So for example, if I go for a kind of like yeah, right, that kind of buzzy quality, if I kind of take that down and I like make the space of my vocal tract bigger as I try to hold on to that, right, it's still got quite a lot of that power. So what happens if I kind of try to hold on to that quality and go down in pitch? right? And I chose E there. It doesn't necessarily have to be that sound. So if I were to kind of like talk from here, right, it's a little bit of a heavier sound and I'm not holding on to that quality perfectly. But we can use these kind of like slight modifications, aiming to find things like that kind of like twangier sound, like maybe using a prompt like cowboy yeehaw kind of sound, right? And have a go at seeing if we can kind of like hold on to or find these kind of qualities which will enable us to kind of find heavier sounds. But that's one thing to think about, right? But what about, say, so there's a few more explorations that are a little bit in this kind of like vein of, there are explorations that we can try to like learn more from and kind of bring back to the table. So something you might have kind of come across is, tilting or like not tilting your head back or forth, for example, as a way of exploring kind of like heavier sounds. So when, you change the kind of like tiltedness of your head, for example, the kind of like vocal mix you're likely to get out as a result will kind of change. And the reason that is because it kind of changes the positions almost of your cartilages a little bit as you do it. So, but when you do this, that the thing is that this is an easy way of finding the quality, right? But what you can try doing is kind of, what we can try doing is, using these kind of sounds to see if we can find a kind of a better or a kind of heavier sound. So, and then see if we can hold on to that. So, for example, if I tilt my head up to the kind of like ceiling, the sound change, there is a sound change there, right? It obviously some of that sound change is attributed to me now looking up at the ceiling and the kind of like space making a bigger impact on sound than it would otherwise. But there's also changes to like my underlying voice as well. So what I could try doing is kind of like aiming for a heavier sound up here, and seeing if I can hold on to that as I kind of change. For example, my head tilt. So if I like find that, right, I can try to hold on to any kind of like qualities of higher intensity that I find. So what I might try doing is kind of like looking up at the ceiling, sliding down to a more appropriate pitch and trying to kind of like find a heavier sound. And trying to hold onto it as I tilt my head back towards a more normal posture. So something that I think a lot of you might have noticed is that a lot of these sounds sound a little bit forced when you go for them, right? So there's a thing that we want to be mindful of when we're going for these sounds, right? It's that these are kind of prompts, these are explorations that we can use to like find new sounds, but they don't necessarily help us kind of like straight away directly in what we want to do with voice. So what you can do, there's a few things. So what you can do is kind of like, for example, say you're kind of like looking up at the ceiling, you kind of bring your head back to like a more appropriate posture and you're on a kind of like heavier sound, right? I'm just going to kind of like tone it down a little bit in terms of pitch so it's a little bit less intense. So maybe I'm there, right? And what we try doing, for example, is, so when we go to speak, it sounds kind of like, pretty intense, but also kind of like strained as I do this, right? It's not necessarily that this posture is like uncomfortable or unsustainable, but I'm not really like moving to it or like navigating it fluidly in the way we'd like expect us to be able to kind of do it, right? So so I have that quality, right? Something I might want to kind of like try thinking about is, can I turn it on and off? Right? Can I make it more typical to how like, get used to kind of like navigating that a little bit? Can I practice doing some speech? So if I was to kind of like continue talking here for a while, trying to like hold on to that quality, I could get some practice in. But something I'm noticing as I try to do this is that I'm almost tensing up everything a little bit more, right? So what I might try doing is kind of periodically throughout my sentences kind of like try and make some words kind of like heavier, and see if I can make that feel a little bit more normal and kind of like less jarring. So if I was kind of like speaking here and then I kind of got louder, maybe I could try throwing in a little bit more of this kind of like weight as I kind of go and kind of like navigate this range a little bit. And what you might be able to do is find a heavier sound and find a kind of, not Goldilocks zone, but kind of like a point where it's almost, you know, less strained, less kind of like evident that there's a lot of effort going in, but, you know, maybe so what we tend to lose, I think, when we kind of like try to go for heavier sounds is often flexibility, right? So we don't want to be at our 100% of max all the time, right? So that's something we want to kind of like internalize and be aware of. We want to be able to go to these heavier sounds, but we want to also be able to kind of like reel back from them a little bit. So we don't want to be going all the way to the very possibly kind of like heaviest sound that we could get to at any kind of given time. So, and there's also some other potential problems with these qualities. So as you kind of heard, right, this kind of sound has quite a lot of extra air in comparison to what we need, right? Right. So whilst breathiness is not the end of the world, it's also not something we see all the time, right? So that can indicate an extra degree of effort. So how might we think about, you know, getting this like to a sound that we almost want? So something we could kind of think about is, if we've got this kind of like sound, can we work to reduce the kind of like breathiness while trying to hold on to some of the weight? Maybe not all of the weight, but some of it at least. So something we could try going for is a like Z sound. Zzz, zzz, right? So something we can change when doing a Z sound is almost the amount of air we're using. Right? But as a Z, it would sound more like zzz, right? And so what we want to maybe get used to doing is balancing that kind of like airflow with that weight. So when you heard me there, I tried to kind of like reel back on the airflow and it cut out. But what we need to do is like learn to navigate some of this stuff. So we might be able to kind of do a change like that if we try. So instead of like right? You can hear a pretty big difference almost in terms of the power there, right? So we can use explorations like the Z sound to see if we can practice peeling back the extra air that we don't need, and see if we can move in the direction of kind of like reduced weight, or not reduced weight, but in the direction of like reduced airflow and maybe a teeny tiny bit of reduced weight, but with a better kind of mix overall as a result, right? So the reasons why we might want to avoid stuff like breathiness is because breathiness is an indicator, or like breathiness reduces the kind of like signal output, right? It reduces the like amount of kind of like sound, or like air, converted into sound. So when that kind of like conversion rate, air quotes, is lower, that might result in us sounding perceptually quieter than we would otherwise, right? So that's another thing we want to kind of like think about when we're kind of navigating this stuff. So in terms of vocal weight, are there any other prompts that immediately come to mind? So just a few more points about vocal weight before I kind of stop this recording and we maybe see if people are interested in asking about other stuff. So one of the things that we might want to try doing with vocal weight especially is try getting back to heavier vocal weights and heavier pitch or lower pitches multiple times throughout the day. But especially in the mornings just after we wake up. So people often find, whilst not all the time, that in the mornings their voices are more sort of prone to being heavy than they would at other times throughout the day. So what we might want to try doing is see if we can find heavier sounds in the morning and then come back to them later throughout the day. Another thing that we might want to kind of think about doing is working towards finding heavier sounds at different points throughout the day and paying attention to if there's anything that kind of like changes how heavy the sounds are. Like, are we quieter at the end of the day when we feel like more tired? Do we have any of this other stuff? And one of the key things that we want to generally start doing when it comes to vocal weight is looking out for kind of like the ways that we kind of like use it in speech, right? So, and also the way that guys use it in speech. So, for example, we didn't really talk about this much so far, but oftentimes people like Masc voices will kind of like use like the intensity variation as a way of emphasizing stuff. So for example, there might still be a change in other variables, but they're not going to be as extreme, right? They might not be as extreme as we might expect, say, for example, in something like a customer service voice vibe thing, or kind of like something like that. Or if they're excited, they might opt for getting louder and like lowering resonance rather than kind of going for like more typical stuff that we might traditionally lean on or think about leaning on. So, for example, there's this clip that I feel like illustrates this to a point. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Actually, no, I don't know if it's worth finding, but essentially there's this clip of a tree falling over and the guy goes, "Yo, oh my God," right? Instead of like, kind of like potentially other variations of that, right? So, what you might expect to see is like, you might hear different words from different people, of course, but you might also kind of expect kind of like the pitch to be higher if it was like, a feminine person kind of shouting that, right? So things like this also matter. So we want to start thinking about, maybe when it comes to vocal weight, the way that we see kind of like cis guys kind of like using vocal weight in their voices for things like emphasis, and starting to kind of like think about that. So but of course, there's two big things I want to say about vocal weight. When we do play around with vocal weight, sometimes there's a tendency to find potentially fatiguing sounds. For example, can be kind of fatiguing, right? So these sounds probably include a little bit of the false vocal folds. So get off my lawn kind of voice, right? Or kind of sounds, right? These sounds have a tendency to be a little bit fatiguing on our vocal folds. So we want to look out for them. And generally when we're playing around with voice stuff, we want to just kind of be aware that, as cliche as this sounds, are we listening to our bodies? Are we stopping when we feel signs of like pain, discomfort, tickliness, or this kind of stuff? Because these can be indicators that whatever we're doing is a little bit fatiguing and maybe has a little bit of a behavior in it that's maybe not too valid poggers, as the kids would say. Nobody's commented on that, so I think I've gotten away with it. So what we might kind of try kind of thinking about when it comes to, I guess, other vocal weight stuff, vocal health. I think that most of the stuff that I've said, I've kind of got into, but there's one more thing. So one thing that I didn't mention before is kind of an exercise, but one thing that we can kind of practice, which I haven't mentioned, is practicing sustaining weight, or practicing sustaining vocal weight. So for example, what we might often find is maybe we can get to a heavier sound, right? But oftentimes what we see is something like this happen. So right? So over time, as we try to sustain the sound, it gets kind of gradually softer and the weight gradually goes down. So one type of exercise that we haven't really talked about before is practicing sustaining heavy sounds and seeing if that makes a difference, and seeing if we can kind of like practice sustaining them for longer. And then what we want to do when this happens is, if we go for a heavy sound, and then over time it starts to get less like heavy, right? What we want to do is see if we can correct it. So something like right? See if we can get back to the sound we were on before and add that weight back in, and see if we can kind of like keep it consistent, even as we start to feel maybe a little bit fatigued. Not kind of like tickly painful fatigue, more kind of like muscle tiredness fatigue, if anything, but preferably not too much fatigue. But see if we can just hold on to the sound and keep it going. So I think that's most of the stuff I wanted to talk about with regards to vocal weight. So I'm actually going to stop this recording here.